This is history 2, and it means that this is the second presentation in a series of 12. And as usual, these series of 12 seek to have some kind of an alignment, but not a prescriptive alignment. Their occurrence week by week as you attend should seem to you as if nothing special is happening, as if there is some kind of free-form exploration going on, which indeed there is. But there is a tapestry of form and pattern underneath that does a lot of choreography. Hopefully, if I do my job right, this choreography will reveal itself in a retrospection, a looking back, so that when the history series is over, we always have an interval in between the various series. And that interval is a chance, it's a time, it's an opportunity for retrospection. Because a retrospective order is a mnemonic order and not an order that is made by imagination. And it's important to consciousness that memory be the mother of muses. That imagination, though in its creative elan, is indispensable to the natural quality of our lives. Imagination becomes a joker in the deck vis-a-vis the kind of retrospective mnemonic order that's necessary to give consciousness a structure. Now this is highfalutin talk, and it's reaching for very powerful ideation. Let's come back to the experience of today and see if we can work towards that. We have, as usual, as our material for the day, we have a pair of books. Instead of using a single book, which one could style now by the late 20th century as the text, instead of using a text, because that text format has been stretched to the breaking point, the text format has been critically approached so many times that by now it's worn very thin. By using a pair of books, we sidestep all of the critical impasses of the issue of a single text. And the pair of books sets up, as a pair will do, a kind of a tuning fork. Used to say that the tuning fork of the real is the way in which polarities are reconciled into unities. One of the most difficult tasks that we have in our lives today is to have a consciousness which is commensurate with the very lives that we are required to lead. Now, we no longer live on a tribal level. It's been a long time since we have. And yet there are many tribal values which we prize and we keep alive. We no longer live in the sheltering comfort of great mythological cycles, though there are many virtues in myth that we seek to preserve, to commemorate, to keep alive. We do not have the ritual comportment any longer that was so painfully developed over hundreds of thousands of years of living with the nature that actually still occurs around us. And in fact, we have a great difficulty in coming back to that nature. But all of these problems are dwarfed by the problem of having a consciousness which is commensurate with all of the challenges of civilized life. And so our education has in its shape, in its design, in its structure, two different cycles that are brought together and made into a unity. Two great polarities. One of them having to do with the cycles of nature, where ritual and myth and symbol are a rather natural part of the ecology of development. One can make cases against it, but finally one can come to see that our intelligence is a part of nature. It occurs in that ecology. But our intelligence has within it a very peculiar quality. It has a quality of transformation. That is to say, it can change its form. And this change of form is not limited to some kind of minor species of object, but the entire nature of objectiveness can be transformed. And not only objectiveness, but all of the processes of nature can also be transformed. And this gives to us an opportunity, a privilege, a right, and a challenge, which is rarely met with. The ecology of nature is complemented for us by an ecology of consciousness. Consciousness which has its own cycle, a cycle that does not begin in nature, but begins with the transformed vision. The transformed vision which beginning and nascent consciousness has. And it goes on to develop art, it goes on to develop history, and finally, the ecology of consciousness is science. All of our civilized structures for about 5,000 years have been the development of this ecology of consciousness. And the problem for men and women has always been how to keep in touch with the developments that are there in nature, with our origins, with the qualities of our life, with the prized actions which we treasure, with the experiences and feeling-toned certainties, and also with the symbolic understandings which we have within our mind. So that we could say, and we have said, we've studied for the first year, how the great wave of nature, this great mysterious process, the universe as a matrix of change, as a huge ocean of process, has its final wave, its final cresting in the mysterious interiorization of our symbolic mind. And all of that is of a single fabric. All of that is recognizable with a single synthesizing ecology. But with transformation, there comes a great change. And with the arrival of consciousness, it is as if the dimensions of space and time themselves accept consciousness, accept not only the impress, but the endomorphic interchange. And so what one deals with in this second cycle, the second year of our education, the second ecology, is a conscious time-space. Not only where there is time and space brought together as space-time, but where consciousness becomes a dimension, so that the four dimensions of space-time actually become a five-dimensional continuum of conscious space-time, which opens up an entirely new issue. Now we saw that 5,000 years ago, one of the most sensitive interplays between nascent civilizations at that time was the interplay of the great inner Asian plateau area. At one end of it was a very ancient Iranian civilization that was founded around the Amu Darya River and had for one of its triumphs the taming of horses. So that horses, pairing of horses together and pairs of horses drawing chariots, all of this happened in the great stretches of Western Central Asia. The other end of Central Asia were the farthest reaches of the Chinese people, the pre-dynastic Chinese peoples. And it was the interchange between these two areas in what is now the desiccated Gobi Desert regions that a new quality of civilization was reached. And out of that new quality of civilization, pre-dynastic China, some 800 years before the first mythical Shah dynasty, there was a figure whose name has been preserved in Chinese history, Fu Xi. And Fu Xi composed the first ordered structure of the way in which to characterize change. And out of this came the I Ching, many thousands of years later. The characteristic structure of the objectiveness of Fu Xi was that there were two polarities. A limited number of vicissitudes that were real, and that if you had polarities, the most that you could get in terms of the varieties of reality in versions keeping consistently the paired reality of a yin and yang were 8 stages. And one finds that echoed again and again throughout human history, wherever there were intelligent, conscious, space-time beings, protagonists like ourselves. This kind of noble eightfold path, or this octave of actuality, held as an island in the midst of arbitrary infinity, as an island of objectivity that wherever existence came into physical being, wherever there were atoms, wherever there were molecules, wherever there were beings, wherever physical actuality comes into focus, the infinite arbitrariness of the mystery of nature becomes focused in a limited set of possibilities. And that 8 seems to characterize this out of possibilities of a primal pair, a primal polarity. Fu Xi, who saw into this, saw that as a complement to the existence of the 8 trigrams, there was an unspoken process that characterized the flow, the morphing interchange of the 8 among themselves. And that this flow had 5 phases. And so one finds, by the beginnings of dynastic China, not only 8 trigrams that held together as physical, objective stages, but that they were choreographed, they were modulated, they were set into a flow by a 5-phase energy cycle. And that in this 5-phase energy cycle, one began with the mysteriousness of nature for sure. One began with the Tao. But just as certain as there was a Tao, there was also an actuality. That actuality itself occurred. And thus, there was such a thing as Te. Te was unity. It was the unity of unity. Just as Tao was the mystery of mysteries, Te was the unity of unities, that oneness does occur. And with this binary of 0 and 1, one could later write a very complex transformational language known today as calculus. Now, it never occurred to the Chinese in all the thousands of years of their civilization to do this. When the early 17th century Jesuits went to China and discovered the I Ching and made a Latin translation and brought it back to Europe, one young mathematical genius named Leibniz saw in Amsterdam a copy of this and saw that with a binary mathematic that one could characterize in a very limited, severe, simple logic the whole morphing pattern of intelligence. And Leibniz, in fact, wrote a wonderful essay on the natural theology of the Chinese, and in discussions with the learned Jesuits of the day, came to understand that the Chinese had missed something that was beneath their noses for many thousands of years. They had missed the application, that there was a mathematical application of what Fuxi had seen originally. The Chinese instead, and incidentally, when Joseph Needham did the great series Science and Civilization in China, he discovered that in fact some Taoist monasteries had developed calculus back in the 9th century AD, but that they had used it as just mental training exercises and never developed it as applied mathematics. What the Chinese developed as applied was the 5-phase energy cycle. They saw that not only Tao and Te as the primal polarity, but they saw that man was a bridge between heaven and earth. Man has a quality of being like the line that holds 0 and 1 together in a relationality. That man, whoever and however we are able to hold 0 and 1 as a set and make them realistic. We can deal with the oneness of things, but we can also deal with the zeroness of things. We have both these capacities. And so to the Chinese 5-phase energy cycle, the 3rd phase, the middle phase, was always Zhen, human-heartedness, Zhen. And Zhen not only balances Tao and Te, but likewise balances 2 other polarities, so that man balances a pair of pairs. Zhen is in the middle. It's in the 3rd phase. Balances Tao and Te, but balances also another polarity. That second polarity is E, which are symbols, and the 10,000 things, sometimes called Li, Li because of the Book of Rites by Confucius. Confucius made a large compendium of all of the ritual comportments, the Book of Li. You can find, there's a 2-volume translation by James Legge from 100 years ago that's still very readable and very good. The second pair was that man's ideas, his symbolic ideas, have something to do with the actual world of 10,000 things. And what it has to do, which is different from the world of nature, it has something to do with the world of symbolic vision. That the 10,000 things are not natural like Te. Te is completely natural. Oneness emerges out of 0 with hardly the blink of an eye. Te and Tao exchange together and work together seamlessly, without any kind of modification. And yet, the other pair working the same way are invisible to nature. In nature, symbols and the visionary, magical forms that are made from them are invisible. And in a curious way, when one is able to inhabit the world of symbols and of vision, of nascent consciousness, the Tao and the Te of nature seem to become invisible. They're not missing, it's that they are not a part of what one calculates in one's frame of reference. And so, as early as about 3,000 years ago, it became a very severe problem for the Chinese, and one which we have taken as a lesson for ourselves. They realized that in order to have a civilized life, in order to have a massive buildup of human-made constructions, human shapes, that are made because of powerful ideas being applied not out of mathematics, but out of this 5-phase energy cycle. That in order to have a civilized life, men and women had to have a way to remind themselves about nature and about existence, that they were still true and they were still important, though they were now invisible. The development of this was the founding of a completely new dynasty in China. It's called the Zhou dynasty. And the Zhou dynasty is a great watershed in Chinese civilization. One finds for the very first time a book which is called the Book of Odes, the Book of Poetry. One finds poetry celebrating men and women understanding life. Splendid people, they say of ourselves. We are still descendants of Prince Millet, who was a distant mythic ancestor who discovered how to cultivate food, and we're grateful to him. We're grateful to that discovery, but now we have something which is, I have to use the Henry Higginson word, splendiferous. Something which is spectacular, which was never seen before in the millet fields. We have the ability to take symbols from our minds and shine them out on the world and transform the world and make things that were never there in nature, but things which are there in conscious time-space. And one of the most powerful of the symbols was taking jade and shaping it so that it had a hole in the middle and had this ring of jade flattened around, called a B, spelled P-I, but pronounced B. B. It's a symbol which holds together the Te and the Tao in a symbol of consciousness. And this became the symbol of heaven. That heaven does this. That when one looks to heaven, one sees that all the stars are really there, but all the space in between the stars is really not there. And that both those elements are choreographed together seamlessly. That the stars and their spaces belong together, and both of them together, the stars and the vast spaces, constitute a structure which is heavenly, which man has to understand somehow is real, so that when he makes his civilization, when he makes his conscious time-space, he remembers to put space in there as well as the stars. That the relationality is not just between things which can be, but also between things which are not. And here is the difficulty. The difficulty is in using a natural language to characterize conscious time-space. The old Chinese saying was in the I Ching, one of the oldest sayings in Chinese civilization, ascribed to Fu Xi 5,000 years ago. He said, heaven suspends its emblems. They do not have to rest on anything. They don't have to touch like post and beam. They are suspended. That there is a mystery to nature where heaven is able to infinitely juggle an eternity without having anything to touch. Whereas man frequently misunderstands this, loses courage vis-a-vis this actual wild truth of the divine, and seeks to try to put the strings there so it won't fall, or to make sure that this is propped up so that it's going to stay there. And it's this tendency to meddle, to interfere with the universal characteristic of reality that makes problems for man in civilizations. All of this comes to a head in history. All of this becomes the primal problem in history, so that a few years ago, I guess it's 35 years ago, it seems unbelievable, I remember when it was first published, E.H. Carr's book, What is History, came out the early 1960s. Carr, who had done a world of scholarship for 30 years on trying to understand how old Tsarist Russia became Bolshevik Russia, became the Soviet Union, and who knew what it was going to become. And Carr was one of these British scholars trying to understand what's going on here. They say that they're in control of the forces of history. They are making a conscious life, are they? And after 30 years of working with it, sensitizing himself to the vicissitudes of all of these concerns, he came out with this wonderful series. Actually, it was a series of lectures on BBC that so many people heard in the early 60s. You could still hear powerful ideas and recognize that you had just been told something really astounding. We are so jaded in the late 90s that we hear universal, bright ideas and we think it's just somebody's opinion. This itself is one of the issues that Carr brings up in What is History? In order to appreciate this, in order to appreciate the precarious procedure that we are involved in now, I want to review just a few of the points that Carr makes in here. There are many, many other books on this. I guess you must know, or if you don't know, it is a cause célèbre in the 20th century. One of the great volumes, Meaning in History, The Theological Implications of the Philosophy of History by Carl Loweth. Or Patrick Gardner, The Nature of Historical Explanation. Or Hans Meyerhoff, The Philosophy of History in Our Time. And there are a number. But I want to take Carr for a minute. What is history? And just introduce. He writes that one of the problems in our time is that histories used to be coherent and now no longer are. For one reason, modern history begins when more and more people emerge into social and philosophic consciousness, become aware of their respective groups as historical entities having a past and a future, and enter fully into history. So that all kinds of people who used to not be paid attention to particularly now emerge, and their groups, their stylizations, their sets of being and doing are now a part of what we would consider history. There is such a thing published by Harvard of a 5-volume history of family life. Can you imagine that? That for the very first time, historians took seriously that there was a history of family life and that one needed 5 huge volumes in order to characterize the history and development of this. There are histories of women. There are histories of Africa. There are histories of the Inuit people, Eskimos. All kinds of people have emerged into history so that the 20th century is characterized by an ever-enlarging pot of concern. Like some Italian family meal, the pot on the table now contains the entire human race for the first time. There isn't anyone who is now able to be left out because they're not important. We realize now, at the beginning of the 21st century, that there's some mysterious quality to mankind as a whole that we must not miss. At the apex of sophisticated classical antiquity, a man who used to teach in his home, his private home in Rome, Plotinus, pointed out that for thousands of years, the old Babylonian-based astrology had given personality to heavenly bodies like the planets or the sun and the moon, to heavenly constellations, and that there was such a thing as the guiding spirits of human beings, the tutorial spirits, the guardian angels, that each person had one. And that there probably were guiding spirits for groups of people, for tribes of people. That the tutorial spirit is tutorial because it's always one step above you, ready to reach down and help you up. And when you go up to that step, the guardian spirit goes one step further. And that this is not an infinite hierarchy, but that finally at some great realization, there God himself is the tutorial spirit and helps you one last step into complete truth. Plotinus said, we have seen the symbols and the manifestations of all kinds of guardian spirits of places, spirits of people, raised to very high levels, but we have never seen the guardian spirit of mankind as a single whole. That the family of man as a whole, as a complete family, the entire species as one family, as a guardian spirit has never been seen. Now Plotinus was echoing 600 years later the idea of Alexander the Great of an ecumene. That there's something mysterious, like the Chinese Te, about unity. That oneness has a tremendous amperage, a tremendous power of existence. Just like Tao, just like zero, has a tremendous power of not being able to be pinned down. One, unity, Te, ecumene, has an exact existential oneness of reality, and that the reality of mankind has never been manifested. We've never seen what we look like because we have never been together in an at-one-ment. And Plotinus recommended that at some time in the future, men and women work towards realizing this, to see what the unity of mankind would evoke from the universe. Because we know from the mystery of the universe that it responds to existence. Mother Nature, no matter how mysterious she is, she loves birth. She loves life. And when we are, she grants us what we are not and lets us work with that dynamic, with that reconciliation. There never has been a unified mankind yet, and yet it is possible. One of the problems of history is the problem that we can see now at the beginning of the 21st century, that we need a universal history in order to understand that we all belong to a family whose form has never been seen. We've never had a group portrait. And we know from all of the laws of physics and math and logic that when you show something to Mother Nature, she responds. She's not some kind of vacant, neutral mirror, but she responds. And if we show her a photograph of mankind unified, what blessed gift will she bestow? Let's take a break and we'll come back. Let's come back exactly where we were. Let's come back to a unified mankind. What would we look like? What would we evoke from nature? But the expectation becomes clouded. And in the 20th century, we have suffered from mishandling history almost more than any other time, almost more than any other generations of human beings. The difficulty is that we no longer know what history is. When it was a national history, Carr uses Green's History of England in the 19th century, which you can still find in 8 nice little matched volumes. In the 19th century, you could write a History of England in 8 volumes. Green did it, Froude did it, a number of people. Macaulay perhaps did the best job, and yet, by the early 20th century, the greatest English historian, Arnold Toynbee, realized that the national unit was not a trustworthy unit by which to characterize human beings in their full scope. The little boy Toynbee, who recalled that he had colored in little comic book versions of Herodotus when he was a child because his family was cultivated, realized that the history of England didn't include anything that Herodotus talked about. Were all these people irrelevant? What about the great Asian histories? And are there great Asian histories? A civilization as old as China, do they not have histories? Yes, they have a book of history, the Shu Qing. But the Shu Qing reads somewhat like a chronological list that's been slightly amended. When one looks to see where is there a Chinese history, one can't go with the Shu Qing. One can't even go with the spring and autumn annals. One has to come all the way up to the Han Dynasty. The Han, who were the Roman Chinese, to Sima Qian. There one finds the beginnings of a real history. And yet the problems that haunt us haunt Sima Qian. Because when he gets to the interesting parts of a development, he realizes that the developments are made by human beings who are enormously talented. That there are human beings who so outstrip an average as to be almost, I guess in our time we call them aliens. They seem to be from a different star system, a different dimension. Thucydides, who begins the histories in the Western tradition, Herodotus wrote about visiting interesting places and is like a pleasant travel book, telling the backgrounds of the places in which one could visit and some of the characteristics of people, and yet Thucydides is radically different. he realizes that you need to have, the Greek word was a theme. History needs a theme. That this theme is developable. And that the nodes upon which the development turns are very often great events. And yet there is a flow which is carried by a protagonist, someone who does the acting in such a way that they also make the actions by their decisions. Not just choices, but decisions. They don't see life and situations as a true fault test where one would make choices, but one makes decisions. One says, this is the way it's going to be, because this is how one sees it. One of the great characters in Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War is Pericles. Pericles, who dared Athens society to say one word about the woman that he chose to live with, Aspasia, who was called a high-class call girl, until Pericles took her in and said, no one will say a word about her. Pericles, who built the Parthenon, so that the straight-edge quality of Homeric Greece was changed forever, because there's not a straight line in the Parthenon. Everything is slightly tilted so that the building as a unity is what is clear, and not any particular line on any particular angle. The clarity of the Parthenon is that this building itself is a unity, is the home of the patron goddess of the city, the virgin goddess of wisdom, of which we Athenians have a special relationship to. And that this extends to us in such a way that human nature in Athens is distinctly different from any other place on the earth. Thucydides has, in the great famous funeral oration of Pericles, Pericles begins with all of his manly grandeur, with all his classical Athenian Greek precision, a precision which predates and more exacts the Sicilian godfather by many, many centuries. Pericles, who says, let me say that our system of government does not copy the institutions of our neighbors. It is more the case of our being a model to others than of our imitating anyone else. Our constitution is called a democracy because power is in the hands not of a minority, but of the whole people. When it is a question of settling private disputes, everyone is equal before the law. This was a radical statement in 430 BC. Law in 430 BC had meant what it had meant for at least 2,000 years. Codified by Hammurabi in the codes, of which the Islamic Sharia is a modern version. What does Zorba say in Kazantzakis' Zorba the Greek? He sinned, he pays. It's a finger, a hand is life. It's very simple. Whereas Athenian justice was a precarious balance of nuances, all based upon the individual who was representative of all the community of individuals, and only a selection of those individuals could make a conscious decision about the right and wrong. Pericles goes on to say in Thucydides' language, what counts is not membership of a particular class, but the actual ability which the man possesses. And he goes on to say, because of our greatness, because of our grandeur, our nobility, our importance, our power, other people are jealous of us, and that's why they seek to take away what we have. We will deny them that actuality. We will fight them. We will make the Aegean safe for democracy. This kind of equality in Thucydides 2,400 years ago becomes highly problematic in the midst of the 20th century, where more than 70 million people were killed when I was a little boy trying to defend this very ideal of democracy. And hardly had the reverberations of bombs died away when the universities were reverberating with an existential angst. We don't know for sure what any of this really is. It isn't just that lots of uncatalogued, unchronicled people now join what has to be historically taken into consideration, but there are many other aspects that no one ever thought about that are now problems. Carr goes on to talk about the whole procedure about historical fact. He says in the 19th century, one could take along with Charles Dickens' character Gradgrind, who wanted only facts. Don't tell me your opinion. Dickens' Gradgrind, who had a great deal of the old Samuel Johnson elan in him, who said what's wrong with most people is they suffer from enthusiasm. And when you get excited about something, you want to have it, to support it, and all of this is highly suspect. David Hume agreed with Samuel Johnson that we can't be sure about what perception does or what anything really is. All of this is very problematical. Carr points out that the empirical tradition tried to make a great case for the fact that there are facts, and yet in the 20th century, all of this has seemed to dissolve. In fact, I delivered a series once about 12 years ago chronicling the 19th century and how it progressively was the dematerialization of actuality. That one begins in 1800 with a very firm understanding about what's what, and by the late 1870s and early 1880s, there are disturbing human beings like James Clerk Maxwell, who said in his equations about electromagnetism that a great deal of the universe is not in existent things, but in magnetism and electrical qualities, which are mathematically very much more powerful than things. That the invisible forces of electromagnetic energies push the universe of things around without a whisper. That what we considered to be basic and fundamental, we're not quite sure. It's mirrored in the way in which the 20th century even takes some fundamentally, supposedly standard, recognized individual and loses track completely of how to even talk about that person. Case in point. Paired with Thucydides is Benjamin Franklin. One would think that Benjamin Franklin is a perfect David Hume character, a Samuel Johnson character. He's extremely factual, He is traditional. What is the possibility of anything going wrong? And in 1806, the first 3-volume collection of the works of Benjamin Franklin is published in England. England because the English, like the French, loved Benjamin Franklin. London, 1806. The complete works in philosophy, politics, and morals of the late Dr. Benjamin Franklin, now first collected and arranged with memoirs of his early life written by himself in 3 volumes. London, Paternoster Row. The works of Dr. Franklin have been often partially collected, never before brought together in one uniform publication. First collection was made by Mr. Peter Collinson in the year 1751. Collection of letters. It was a collection of letters, in fact, on electricity. But Franklin's complete works in 3 volumes in 1806, superseded by many collections of Benjamin Franklin during the 19th and very early 20th century. And finally, Yale University Press announced The Papers of Benjamin Franklin. First volume came out, I believe it was about 1954, 55. (1959). This is the first volume to come from a great scholarly undertaking, the assembly and editing of Benjamin Franklin's complete writings and correspondences, to be published over a period of 15 years. Well, they're up to volume 32 in 1997, and they have almost another long decade, the longest, most fruitful decade of Franklin's life. Who knows? It will be another 25 years. It will have taken 65 years minimally to publish an edition of Benjamin Franklin. What is going on here? The fact is that the 20th century has shown us a differential consciousness whose techniques of analysis have outstripped completely the ability to synthesize. Because synthesis, integration, is a natural functioning, whereas differential consciousness is something which belongs to what used to be called the supernatural. It belongs to the invisible realms, realms where magnetic energies, electrical energies, course freely. And it seems that our transformed mind gives us access to a differential realm which is right up there with the magnetic and electrical and atomic forces and energies. And we see no end in sight because it's rather eternally infinite on the scale. It used to be in the 19th century that music was composed according to certain modes, and yes, the medieval musicians had certain modes, Mixolydian and so forth, and yet in the 20th century, suddenly it was shown that all musical modes are quite arbitrary, that there are infinite musical modes. One can write musics for which no one has ever heard a single note, and yet there are entire orchestras available. What now? And so man stands like some blasted, scared cinder child on the threshold of a new millennium, absolutely incapacitated by anything that he can do in face of an avalanche of possibility. Jailed not by something which cages you in, but paradoxically jailed by that which doesn't cage you at all, ever, on any scale, in any dimension. And this deep fearfulness. What will we do? And where this comes to rest is in history. Poetically, Carr, towards the end of his introduction to what is history, writes this: the hidden hand that was assumed to take care of the universal harmony, the facts of history were themselves a demonstration of the supreme fact of a beneficent and apparently infinite progress towards higher things. This was the age of innocence, and historians walked in a Garden of Eden without a scrap of philosophy to cover them naked and unashamed before the God of history. Since then, we have known sin and experienced a fall. And those historians who today pretend to dispense with a philosophy of history are merely trying vainly and self-consciously, like members of a nudist colony, to recreate the Garden of Eden in their garden suburb. Today, the awkward question can no longer be evaded. We need to ask, what is history? What is going on here? What is happening here? As we've talked about several times, the difficulty falls not back to the mysteries of nature. Our kind were teased on the mysteries of nature. We can still go back and be absorbed in the participation of the sea. We can stand for hours among the plungings of the tide and just be there. Our bodies still remember that and still take joy. You have to be pretty callous not to appreciate a fantastic sunset, or not to feel a glorious kinesthetic wonder at a huge comet setting up in parallel to some of the great planets moving clearly in the sky. But all of that is nature. All of that is the mystery of the universe, which has always been our context and has never been spelled out to us plainly. It has always been that men and women have had to deal with it in a participation of givingness. One expects to be immersed in nature. And this whole process, rather the characteristic of being immersed in a process, was what was fundamental to the orientation of human reality. And on every stage of integration, it carries its impress. Like a baby who carries the impress of the mother's body, we carried the impress that nature's mysterious process held us in deep regard. Her mystery was a mystery of love, not of peril. There were times when the typhoon would come, but those are passing events in nature. But that process of nature was paralleled by a second process, the process of language, the process of myth. And part of our whole first year was to appreciate how these two great processes were aligned, and language and nature had their definite connection. The referent of words, in order to be usable, had to be in nature, but it didn't go to nature, it went to the objective existence that was in between these two great processes. That objective existence was where ritual comportment registers, like our body registers. And so the body of things The physical objectivity of things. Existence is where the referent of language goes to, but it goes to it with great confidence because the process of myth is a parallel to the process of nature by and large. And mythic cycles follow the natural cycles. That's how they're whole. And they're held whole because the body registers both processes as parallel. And one knows, one feels that this is true. This is the way it should be. This is how it works. This is life-giving. This is nutritive. We can endorse this. We can have our children and bring them into this, and they can do likewise because this is trustworthy. And so this impress, which goes back countless thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, maybe hundreds of thousands of years, is all put into jeopardy by history. Because like nature and like myth, history is also a process. But it is a process that works in a distinctly different way from the processes of nature or of myth. And we saw that history, in fact, is not the first indication of this because vision also works in a different way from nature or from myth. But vision was always considered as some kind of divine quality that was there above nature or below nature or behind nature, and somehow it was always accepted. There was some kind of leeway, some kind of margin made for it. Even when it was called magic. The beginnings of differential consciousness, this quality of vision, of being able to see from the mind, not through eyes that look referentially at things, but eyes that begin to look at interior things. To look at the image éternelle within, and to see the world in those terms, in that way, and transformation of the world was somehow worked in, but that was as far as it went. So that the processes of nature and the processes of myth and the processes of vision were patiently linked together. But the process of history, so recent, really inscrutable, almost as mysterious as nature itself. One can learn a mythic language. One can even learn a magic language like mathematics. But to deal with history is like trying to navigate nature. It's an enormous mystery. It's unbelievable because dimensions proliferate. As you begin to differentiate, there's more to differentiate. It has a fractal, maddening quality of being more and more. The more and more you have more and more. And so one gets caught into the exact opposite, the total converse of the tar baby. One gets caught in the perilous openness of being openly open all the time. And nothing seems founded. Nothing seems available. And there's only one tether that holds in all of that swirl of differential, historical, cosmicness. The only tether that holds is memory. Memory is the only tie line by which one could have a single chance at some orientation. And so history, with all of its jeopardy and perils, is masterable only by someone who remembers to remember? Who trains themselves to remember? And the training of memory was considered as one of the great adjuncts of civilization. One of the purposes of Thucydides' speeches in his history of the Peloponnesian War was so that school children would learn these speeches, so that little Athenian boys would embody in themselves the language of a Pericles at his funeral oration and get the feel of how one is, how a man is on this scale with these events. And from time to time, the same technique was used again and again. In the 19th century, British schoolboys were given Thucydides, given the funeral oration to memorize for exactly the same purpose, to run the British Empire. If you're going to have a world empire, you have to have people, especially young men, who are going to be at home emotionally in running this world. When that is gone, and not gone because it's discredited, but vanished because of almost an infinite proliferation of options. It isn't just that one now knows that there are Chinese or Indians, in addition to the Greeks. There are Mayans. The examples of noble humanity are legion. The numbers of fantastic speeches characterizing human consciousness in view of events and situations, one would have dictionaries for. And indeed there are, and this is part of the problem. When Benjamin Franklin was young, when Benjamin Franklin was 19, he wrote out a plan of conduct for himself. He wanted to get for himself a reference, a square of reference, a frame of reference, a square of attention. So he wrote out 4 points for himself as a letter to himself in his journal. Here's how it reads. Those who write of the art of poetry teach us that if we would write what may be worth the reading, we ought always, before we begin, to form a regular plan and design of our piece. Otherwise, we shall be in danger of incongruity. Incongruity, incidentally, is a geometric term. It means that two geometric shapes do not fit together. What geometric shapes? The first geometric shape is what you do, your actions, which register on the plane of ritual comportment. Existence is very largely shapes of what we do. The shapes which are congruent with that are shapes of what we think. So that the symbols and the rituals are congruent. And because when they are congruent, then the process of nature and the process of language and the process of vision are held by that congruency. The old formula in Zarathustra, Nisgatha, some 4,000 years ago, was thought, word, and deed. Thought, word, and deed. Symbol, myth, ritual. And that when they're aligned, when they're pure, then nature and the supernatural both are held into a fantastic unity. It's like the Chinese Zhen, when man is the bridge, heaven and earth sing together. There's no worry, there is no peril. That even though vision, even though the process of the differential magi is quite distinctly different from nature, yet they can move together. And clockwise and counterclockwise can come together. Thought, word, and deed. But what stands outside, what stands completely outside of this working agreement is the individual. The individual as an artist, the objective spiritual person who is not constrained by the limitations of ritual. Not constrained by the process of language. Not constrained by the shapes of symbols. The spiritual individual, the spiritual person, is quite independent of that, can be. And so Franklin's concern here, Franklin's concern is to have a plan of action which he as a person can embody. There's all the difference in the world between a story and the storyteller. In myth, the story is paramount, but in history, the storyteller is paramount. And it turns out to be a very precarious seat. He who would tell his own history needs to be quite conscious, for the pitfalls are swift, steep, and unending. And so in Franklin's day, this is 1726, he was 19 in 1726, he had a plan of action because it was a sort of empirical thing to do with your personhood. It's what David Hume did. It's what Samuel Johnson did. Even Sir Isaac Newton, even old Leibniz. They had a plan for their lives which they lived out. They wrote the play which they would be in. They didn't hope to live out a myth. It's not myths to live by that's important, unless you're just going to be tribal. If you're going to be tribal, just get in with the myths. But if you're going to be individual, you're going to be your person, your conscious person. What is Franklin's plan of action? 1726. Here's how he writes. I am apt to think it is the same as to life. I have never fixed a regular design in life, by which means it has been a confused variety of different scenes. I am now entering upon a new one. Therefore, let me make some resolutions and form some scheme of action, and henceforth I may live in all respects like a rational creature. 19 years old, 1726. 4 points. A 4-point plan of action to be a rational creature. What is it? Rational comes from what? It comes from ratio. In nature, one can deal with whole numbers, but in consciousness, very often one deals with ratios. Whole numbers respond to existence, to things. Ratios respond to possibilities, which is a differential form of things. So the spiritual person is used to computing possibilities of which there is no box that contains them. Here are the 4 points. For Franklin, it is necessary for me to be extremely frugal for some time till I have paid what I owe. To endeavor to speak truth in every instance, to give nobody expectations that are not likely to be answered, but aim at sincerity in every word and action, the most amiable excellence in a rational being. Notice how he's reaching back and he's tying his tether, because he's going to remember these 4 points, and when he remembers, his memory on these are going to carry him back to thought, word, and deed, the way nature and vision are held in a working tandem. 3, to apply myself industriously to whatever business I take in hand, and not divert my mind from my business by any foolish project of growing suddenly rich, for industry and patience are the surest means of plenty. Anybody who's ever tamed a wild horse knows that when you get the tether on that horse, you climb down that tether to that horse, you better not be thinking about riding off into the sunset. You better watch those hooves, and they bite. And if you get thrown hard enough, you can really crack up. For Franklin, I resolved to speak ill of no man whatever, not even in a matter of truth, but rather by some means of excuse the faults I hear charged upon others, and upon proper occasion speak all the good I know of everybody. So the 19-year-old Franklin sets himself this beautiful plan of action. He's in London for the first time. He's ready for a new Franklin, and within months, the whole thing is completely scrapped. Because he ran across the fact that the England of the 1720s was full of religious tracts talking about what's empirical, what's objective, and so Franklin ends up publishing some first principles which are no longer numbered. They go on quite a long time, and when it does come to numbering, they have these beautiful little qualities. Being mindful that before I address the deity, my soul ought to be calm and serene, free from passion and perturbation, or otherwise elevated with rational joy and pleasure. I ought to use a countenance that expresses a filial respect, mixed with a kind of smiling that signifies inward joy and satisfaction and admiration. And then prayer. O wise God, my good Father, thou beholdest the sincerity of my heart and of my devotion. Grant me a continuance of thy favor. What happened to thought, word, and action? It turns out that in the vicissitudes of an individual dealing with history, that thought, word, and action are very nice. They don't go very far. What goes really far is the mysterious granting of grace that comes out of nature and still has efficacy somehow to you who thought you were alone there. And this yields a very mysterious response. In differential consciousness, where one least expects to find it, in the infinite morass of the ocean of history, comes with a contact remembered from the mystery of nature. Mother Nature blows a kiss that goes all the way through us and goes out and is received by someone else out there beyond the ocean of history. And Mother Nature seeks to embrace Father Cosmos, who reaches back to hold her. And we somehow, like some kind of mysterious invisible prism, get to participate in this nuptial. And we feel somehow that we have witnessed something very, very profound. That reality is quite whole, despite our inability to characterize it. And the inability is not through ignorance, but through infinite wisdom of knowing that we don't know the end of it. And yet it still happens. In this quality of history, one of the most profound of all the historians, writing about 100 years after Franklin, writing in 1830. His name was Hegel. Hegel, in his lectures on the philosophy of history, describes world history as it appears at first glance from a trained philosophic mind who's been lecturing for about 40 years. He writes in this way. This is quoted from Karl Loweth, Meaning in History. We see a vast picture of changes and transactions, of manifold forms of people, states, individuals in unresting succession. On every hand, aims are adopted and pursued. In all these occurrences and changes, we behold human action and suffering predominant. Everywhere, something akin to ourselves, and therefore everywhere something that excites our interests, for or against. Sometimes we see the more comprehensive mass of some general interest advancing with comparative slowness and subsequently sacrificed to an infinite complication of trifling circumstances and so dissipated into atoms. Then again, with a vast expenditure of power, a trivial result is produced, while from what appears unimportant, a tremendous issue proceeds. And when one combination vanishes, immediately another appears in its place. The general thought, the category, which first presents itself in this restless mutation of individuals and peoples existing for a time and then vanishing, is that of change at large. You see, the old matrix of change of nature, still viable, still real all the while. One is reminded of the great poem, The Heights of Machu Picchu, by Pablo Neruda. The end of the Second World War, he had been the ambassador to Spain. He had seen the Second World War for almost a decade. He's up in the Andes Mountains at Machu Picchu, trying to piece together what has happened to us in our time. And while he's musing, flitting silently over the whole landscape are shadows of condors. And he writes in the poem, the shadows of condors pursue us all this while. Hegel completes it. The sight of the ruins of some ancient sovereign directly leads us to contemplate this thought of change in its negative aspect. But the next consideration, which allies itself with that of change, is that change, while it imports dissolution, involves at the same time the rise of a new life. That while death is the issue of life, life is also the issue of death. And so our investigation of history continues and begins. We have 10 more presentations. And you have a history to write. And your history is a history of the last 2 years. And if you've been involved in this education, you have a template like Franklin had, but with a revision like Hegel had, and with something else that comes almost 200 years after Hegel. You have this educational process to work out after you have written your history one last quarter. Because the course goes on after your histories are due in another 10 weeks. The course goes on to science. And science concerns itself with the objective cosmos. It concerns itself with heaven, that heaven is quite real. You can put it in the plurals, but it's a plurals that belongs into a set of unity. The heavens are real. Their magnetism can be measured. Their light can be put into a spectrometer and analyzed. And even though one has only one photon from this particular exact angle leading to that particular exact star, we know that that star, Antares, is a super red giant that is nearing the end of its life cycle, because every photon of light from it contains all that information. We can differentiate to the point of understanding what that is exactly. But what we do with it, that's a matter for us, for our histories. Now, when you write your histories, you can take 8 boxes, 8 big cardboard boxes, and lay them in your living room. The first one you can label nature. The second, ritual. The third, myth. They're all the stages of the education. The fourth, symbols. The fifth, vision. The sixth, art. The seventh, history. The eighth one you have to put before nature and just label that pre-cycle. That was when you were untethered, when you were not remembering. And into these boxes, whatever documentation you can find, pour them in, let them distribute. If you were in the education, when you were in ritual, you made masks. You made a pair of masks, one of a food and one of a feeling. One that looked out and one that looked in. That mask of food that came and became a part of your body, that mask of feeling that went out from your feeling body to the room. Put those masks in there. They're material for your history. When you did your art, your sculptures, put those in art. And the sculptures had permutations, and you did permutations of other people's sculptures. All of that, all of this is material out of which you will develop your basic material, and out of which pattern you develop your basic chronology. But all of that, as Carr said, is not history. All of that is but the architect making sure that he has good wood and well-mixed concrete. And when you have that material, then you must design your building. Then you have to have some kind of philosophy of history, some kind of idea. What kind of life would you like to have? What kind of life would you like to lead? And if you're wise, you will look at a life that continues, not a static life that has static criteria, but a life that dynamically moves and has the options for mid-course corrections. And because it's mid-course all the time, one might even incorporate an algorithmic genetic quality of being able to correct corrections. On this scale, you don't know what kind of history will turn out. All I can say is that I've been teaching this for almost 3 decades. No one has ever written a history. But then you're to be loved and excused, because there are no books anywhere that have a proper history at the end of the 20th century. It just means that you're human. But that you continue to come and struggle with this means that you're still willing to learn. And that's the difference. Jacob Bernowski in his Ascent of Man said the hand is the cutting edge of the mind. Vision is the cutting edge of the spirit. And as long as you continue, it's still viable and still all possible. More next week. Thank you.